The grand ballroom of the Obsidian Plaza was a spectacle of shimmering crystal and cold ambition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the desperate musk of social climbing. At the center of the whirlpool stood Caspian Thorne, a man who wore his vanity like a tailored suit. He was celebrating his impending appointment as Senior Vice President of Vane Industries, a position he believed he had earned through sheer brilliance, rather than the quiet subsidies his wife Aurelia had been funneling into the firm's quarterly reports for years. Aurelia stood at the periphery of the light, her champagne untouched. She wore a simple, elegant gown of charcoal silk, her presence muted by design. For 3 years, she had allowed Caspian to play the role of the Titan, keeping her own status as a master acquisition specialist a closely guarded secret. She had wanted a partner. She had received a parasite. The clinking of a silver spoon against a glass silenced the room. Caspian stepped onto the dais, his mother, Leocadia, hovering just behind his shoulder like a vulture in pearls. "Friends, colleagues, and betters," Caspian began, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "Tonight we celebrate not just a promotion, but the restoration of the Thorne legacy. I owe my success to the iron will of my mother, Leocadia, who taught me that a man is defined by the empire he builds." He paused, his gaze drifting to the shadows where Aurelia stood. A smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth, a look of genuine pity that made Aurelia's blood turn to ice. "And of course," Caspian continued, the room erupting in low titters, "I must thank my lovely wife, Aurelia. While she spends her days at her little clerical hobby in that nondescript office downtown, her modest contributions keep our pantry stocked while I focus on the heavy lifting of global commerce. It's important for every great man to have a quiet little mouse at home to keep his feet on the ground." Leocadia leaned into the microphone, her voice a sharp, polished blade. "Indeed, it's a pity she doesn't have the Thorne ambition, but I suppose someone has to handle the filing while the men handle the world." The laughter that followed was polite but jagged. Aurelia felt the weight of 100 condescending eyes. Caspian didn't look at her with love. He looked at her as a piece of background furniture that had finally started to clash with his new decor. Aurelia didn't flush with embarrassment. She didn't flee the room. Instead, she felt a strange, profound sense of relief. The debt of her silence had finally been paid in full. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone, sending a 2-word message to a contact named Balthazar. "Execute Phoenix." As Caspian stepped down to accept handshakes and backslaps, Aurelia slipped out through the service entrance. In the back of a waiting black sedan, a man with white streaked hair and a face carved from granite handed her a leather-bound folder. "The Board of Vane Industries has just received the notice of the hostile takeover, Aurelia," Balthazar said, his voice a low rumble. "You now hold 51% of the voting shares. Technically, you are your husband's employer. Shall we inform him?" Aurelia looked out at the glowing spire of the Vane building, her eyes reflecting the cold lights of the city. "No," she whispered. "Caspian wants to be a man defined by his empire. Let's let him enjoy his promotion for one more night. Tomorrow, I want to see his face when he realizes he's been working for the mouse all along." She signed the final page with a flourish of ink that felt like a death warrant. Caspian Thorne went to bed that night, dreaming of a throne. He had no idea that while he was busy mocking his wife's little job, she was busy buying the floor beneath his feet. The mouse was gone. The architect had arrived. The morning following the gala arrived with a deceptive, golden tranquility. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thorne penthouse, illuminating the minimalist luxury that Aurelia had curated with her own earnings. Earnings Caspian still believed were the byproduct of a modest administrative salary. Caspian was already awake, humming a tune of triumph as he adjusted a silk tie in the dressing room mirror. He looked like a man who had inherited the earth, unaware that he was merely a tenant on a property whose lease had just been terminated. When Aurelia entered the kitchen, she found Leocadia already there, presiding over the breakfast table like an exiled queen who had finally been invited back to the palace. Leocadia didn't offer a greeting. She simply slid a printed document across the marble counter. It was a list of real estate listings, estates in the most exclusive zip codes of the city. Now that Caspian has reached his rightful station, Leocadia said, her voice brittle with entitlement, this starter home is no longer sufficient for the Thorne name. We will need something with a proper wing for me, and of course a more secluded space for you, Aurelia. Somewhere out of the way, where your clerical friends won't be seen by our new peers. Aurelia poured herself a cup of black coffee, her movements precise and calm. She didn't look at the listings. Caspian hasn't even had his first day as senior VP yet, Leocadia. Isn't it a bit premature to be spending money that hasn't hit the account? Caspian walked into the kitchen, smelling of expensive sandalwood and arrogance. He leaned over and kissed the top of Aurelia's head, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like a brand. Aurelia. Darling, always so cautious. That's why you'll always be a clerk. You don't understand how the world of high finance works. Visionaries don't wait for the money. They command it. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his expression shifting into something stern and patriarchal. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. Now that I'm moving into the upper echelons of Vane Industries, it's time for us to formalize our roles. My colleagues' wives are philanthropists, hostesses, and symbols of their husband's success. They don't work in gray cubicles for five-figure salaries. It's embarrassing, Aurelia. Aurelia set her cup down. The porcelain clicked against the marble with the finality of a gavel. Embarrassing to whom, Caspian? To the family, Leocadia interjected, her pearls rattling as she leaned forward. A Thorne man doesn't have a wife who punches a clock. It suggests he can't provide. It suggests a lack of vigor. Caspian has decided, and I wholeheartedly agree, that you will submit your resignation today. Caspian nodded, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a pre-written resignation letter. All it needed was Aurelia's signature. I've already spoken to my department. They'll find you a graceful way out. You'll stay home, manage the move, and learn how to run a household that fits my new title. Consider it a promotion of your own, from clerk to Mrs. Caspian Thorne, full-time. Aurelia looked at the letter. It was addressed to the HR department of her little hobby job. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. Caspian truly believed he was rescuing her from the drudgery of work, never realizing that her work was the only reason Vane Industries hadn't collapsed under his incompetent management 2 years ago. And if I refuse? Aurelia asked, her voice a low, dangerous hum. Caspian laughed, a sharp, barking sound. Refuse? With what resources? I've already contacted the bank. Since I'm the primary earner now, I've requested that the joint accounts be restructured under my sole authorization. It's for your own protection, really. You won't have to worry about the stress of bills anymore. Aurelia felt the final thread of her patient's snap. He wasn't just trying to control her. He was attempting to erase her. He wanted her to be a ghost in her own home, a silent witness to his stolen glory. She thought of Balthazar and the Phoenix protocols. She thought of the boardroom that was currently being prepared for her arrival, an arrival that would be the most violent awakening of Caspian's life. I won't be signing that, Caspian, she said, her voice gaining a cold, metallic edge. Caspian's smile vanished. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. Excuse me? You will do as you're told. You are a Thorne, and you will act like one. I am the one with the power here. I am the one Vane Industries is betting its future on. Vane Industries is betting its future on someone, Caspian, Aurelia said, standing up. She looked down at him, her silhouette framed by the morning light, making her look taller, sharper, and infinitely more formidable. But it isn't you. You want to talk about vigor? You want to talk about power? You've spent 3 years playing king in a castle I built. You've confused my silence for weakness, and my generosity for a lack of ambition. Leocadia stood up, her face a mask of outrage. How dare you speak to him like that? You are a nobody, a girl from the suburbs with a filing cabinet for a brain. Aurelia turned her gaze to Leocadia. The older woman actually took a step back, startled by the sheer, predatory intensity in Aurelia's eyes. Leocadia, I suggest you start packing that fur coat, because by 5 o'clock today, this house, which by the way is registered to my private holding company, not the Thorne family, will be locked. And your son's senior VP office? I'd be surprised if he's allowed past the lobby. Caspian let out a strangled laugh. You've gone insane. The stress has finally broken you. I'm going to work. I have a board meeting to attend. The most important meeting of my life. When I get back, you'll have that letter signed, or I'll have the locks changed myself." He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, Leocadia following him while hurling insults over her shoulder. Aurelia stood in the middle of her silent kitchen, the resignation letter still sitting on the counter. She picked it up, tore it into 4 neat pieces, and dropped them into the trash. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Balthazar. "Is the board assembled?" she asked. "They are waiting, Aurelia." Balthazar's voice rumbled. "And Caspian just swiped his badge at the entrance. He's currently in the elevator, telling the security guard he's the new boss." "Perfect," Aurelia said, walking toward her own dressing room, where a bespoke navy suit, the armor of a chairman, was waiting. "Let him have his moment in the sun. The eclipse starts in 30 minutes. Caspian Thorne thought he was walking toward his coronation. He thought he had finally tamed the mouse and secured his throne. He didn't know that the elevator he was riding in belonged to his wife. He didn't know that the air he was breathing was being paid for by the woman he had just tried to fire. He was a man walking into a trap of his own making, and the architect was already waiting for him in the boardroom. The headquarters of Vane Industries was a monolith of steel and tinted glass that usually hummed with the quiet, orderly vibration of corporate greed. But today the vibration had turned into a frantic, jagged frequency. Word of the hostile takeover had leaked at 8:01 a.m., and by 9, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of adrenaline and cold sweat. In the executive wing, the Thorne faction, a small group of sycophants Caspian had cultivated with promises of future power, was huddled in the hallway. They whispered about Project Phoenix and the ghost who had moved 60 million shares overnight. No one knew who the new owner was. Some whispered it was a rival tech giant, others feared it was a liquidator coming to strip the company to its bones. Caspian Thorne strode through the lobby like a conquering hero, oblivious to the fact that the security guards didn't snap to attention with their usual reverence. He was too busy adjusting his cufflinks and practicing his paternal leader smile. He spotted the chief financial officer, a man named Sterling who looked like he had aged a decade in a single hour. "Sterling, why the long face?" Caspian boomed, clapping the man on the shoulder. "The new owner is clearly a visionary. They've seen the potential in my new leadership. They're likely here to give me even more autonomy." Sterling looked at Caspian with a mixture of pity and horror. "Caspian, you don't understand. This wasn't a friendly merger. It was a surgical strike. The new chairman has already frozen all discretionary spending, including your renovation fund for the VP suite. They've been in the building for 20 minutes, and they haven't spoken to anyone but the legal team." Caspian's smile faltered, but his ego was too bloated to let the truth in. "Nonsense. They're just setting the stage. High-level power plays, Sterling. Watch and learn." Inside the boardroom, the tension was so dense it felt like a physical weight. The 14 members of the board sat in high-backed leather chairs, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. At the head of the table sat Balthazar, his presence like a dark cloud before a storm. He hadn't said a word. He simply tapped a silver fountain pen against a stack of NDAs. Caspian burst into the room, followed by his mother, Leocadia, who had insisted on being present for her son's ascension. She took a seat in the back, her eyes scanning the room for anyone she needed to snub. "Balthazar, isn't it?" Caspian said, sliding into the seat directly to the right of the chairman's empty chair. "I appreciate the efficiency. Let's get the formalities over with. I assume the new owner wants a full report on my vision for the Thorne era?" Balthazar stopped tapping his pen. He looked at Caspian, his eyes devoid of emotion. "The new owner is already quite familiar with your vision, Mr. Thorne. In fact, she's been auditing your vision for the better part of 3 years." Caspian stiffened. "She? Yes," Balthazar replied, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "The chairman has spent her morning reviewing the company's internal leakages. It seems someone has been using the Vane corporate accounts to pay for, let's see, a $10,000 monthly stipend for a Leocadia Thorne, as well as the lease on a certain penthouse. Are you familiar with these transactions, Caspian?" The room went deathly silent. The other board members shifted in their seats, sensing the scent of blood in the water. Leocadia's pearls rattled as she gasped. "That's family business," Caspian hissed, his voice dropping into a defensive growl. "Those are perks of my position. I am the future of this company." "Actually," a voice rang out from the doorway, "you are the liability of this company." The double doors swung open with a synchronized thud. The staff in the outer office stopped breathing. The board members rose instinctively. Aurelia Thorne walked in. She was no longer the mouse in charcoal silk. She was dressed in a navy suit that cost more than Caspian's car, her hair pulled back into a sharp, lethal blade. She didn't look like a wife. She looked like a monarch who had returned to find her palace infested with vermin. She didn't wait for Caspian to speak. She didn't acknowledge Leocadia's shocked scream. Aurelia walked straight to the head of the table. Balthazar stood up and pulled out the chairman's chair. Aurelia sat. She placed her hands on the table, her wedding ring catching the light, the only thing about her that still linked her to the man sitting 2 feet away. She looked at Caspian, whose jaw had dropped so far he looked grotesque. "Close your mouth, Caspian," Aurelia said, her voice echoing with the authority of someone who owned the air they were breathing. "It makes you look even more incompetent than your expense reports suggest." "Aurelia?" Caspian choked out, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "What is this? What kind of joke is this?" "This isn't a joke, Mr. Thorne," Balthazar interjected. "This is a board meeting, and as of 8 a.m. today, Mrs. Thorne owns 51% of Vane Industries, which means your promotion is subject to her approval." Aurelia leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Caspian's with a terrifying, icy clarity. "And I've spent the last hour reviewing your performance, Caspian. I'm afraid I have some very bad news for your Thorne era." The boardroom, once Caspian's promised kingdom, had become his cage. He looked at the woman he had tried to force into a resignation only hours ago, and for the first time in his life, he saw the truth. He wasn't the giant, he was the shadow, and the sun had just come out. The boardroom had transformed from a theater of ego into a clinical chamber of judgment. Caspian remained frozen in his seat, his hand still hovering near the armrest of the chairman's chair, as if he could still claim it by proximity. Behind him, Leocadia's face had turned a mottled purple, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The board members, seasoned predators themselves, had already sensed the change in the food chain. They sat in perfect, terrifying silence, their gazes fixed on Aurelia. Aurelia didn't look like a woman seeking revenge. She looked like a woman performing a long-overdue house cleaning. She tapped a command on the tablet embedded in the mahogany table, and the massive high-definition screens on the far wall flickered to life. "Caspian," Aurelia began, her voice steady and devoid of heat. "You've spent the morning talking about your vision. It's time we look at the actual math behind that vision." A spreadsheet appeared on the screen, a labyrinth of numbers that highlighted a series of transactions in glowing neon red. For the past 18 months, Vane Industries has been hemorrhaging capital through a subsidiary called Thorne Heritage Consulting. A fascinating firm, considering its only listed office is a P.O. box in the Caymans, and its only consultant appears to be your mother's bridge partner. Leocadia let out a sharp, indignant cry. "That is a legitimate legacy project." Caspian promised. "Caspian promised money that didn't belong to him," Aurelia interrupted, her eyes never leaving her husband. "He funneled $3.2 million into that shell company. He used it to pay for your gambling debts at the Monte Carlo circuit, Leocadia. He used it to buy the very pearls you're wearing. And most recently, he used it to pay for the renovation of a penthouse that he claimed was a corporate asset, but which is actually registered under a trust in his name." Caspian finally found his voice, though it was thin and cracking. It's all standard executive compensation. Aurelia, everyone does it. I was building the brand. I'm a Thorne. I have to maintain a certain standard." "A Thorne?" Aurelia leaned forward, the light from the screen casting a sharp, blue shadow across her face. "You're a Thorne because I allowed you to use the name. But in this room, you are an employee, and an employee who steals $3 million isn't an executive. He's a thief." She swiped the screen again. A new document appeared, a series of forged signatures on corporate bonds. The room gasped. Forging a chairman's signature was a federal crime. You thought Sterling was looking the other way because he respected you, Caspian, Aurelia said, glancing at the trembling CFO. But Sterling was looking the other way because he was terrified of you. You bullied the accounting department, you threatened the juniors, and you told everyone that if they questioned the Thorne way, they'd be blacklisted from the industry. She looked back at the board. But there is no Thorne way anymore. There is only the Vane way. And under my leadership, we don't subsidize the fantasies of a man who can't even balance a checkbook without stealing from his own wife's inheritance. Caspian's arrogance finally snapped, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. He lunged across the table, his hand reaching for the tablet as if he could delete the evidence by force. Balthazar didn't even have to move. Two massive security guards who had been standing at the door were on Caspian in a second, pinning his arms behind his back. "Get your hands off me!" Caspian screamed, his face pressed against the polished wood. "Aurelia, stop this. We're family. Think of the scandal. If you send me to jail, you'll be the wife of a convict. You'll be ruined." Aurelia stood up slowly. She walked around the table until she was standing directly over him. She reached down and gripped his chin, forcing him to look her in the eye. "I'm not the wife of a convict, Caspian," she whispered, loud enough for every board member to hear. "I'm the woman who just served you with divorce papers and a criminal referral at the same time. The scandal won't be mine. It will be the story of how a mediocre man tried to steal a queen's crown and realized too late that she was the one who forged it." She looked at the security guards. "Take him to his office. Let him watch while the forensics team boxes up his things." "And Leocadia?" The older woman frozen, her hand clutching her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. "The fur coat stays," Aurelia said. "It was bought with company funds. It's now corporate property." The boardroom doors closed behind a screaming Caspian and a sobbing Leocadia, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the air itself had been scrubbed clean. Aurelia turned back to the board. They were all sitting up straighter now, their pens ready, their eyes full of a new, terrified respect. "Now," Aurelia said, sitting back in her chair, "let's talk about the real future of Vane Industries. And this time, we'll be using my math." By the time the sun crested the glass spires of the city, the name Thorne had become a radioactive word. In the digital age, a scandal doesn't just travel. It incinerates. At 6 a.m., Aurelia had authorized the release of a press statement through a boutique PR firm known for its surgical precision. The headline wasn't just a news item, it was a wrecking ball. Vane Industries announces hostile takeover. Majority shareholder Aurelia Thorne appointed CEO, CFO Caspian Thorne under investigation for multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The social standing that Leocadia and Caspian had cultivated for decades, a fragile ecosystem of exclusive club memberships, gala invitations, and old money posturing, was wiped out in exactly 60 minutes. Leocadia Thorne woke up to the sound of her phone vibrating so violently it danced off her nightstand. It wasn't the usual calls from her bridge club or the luxury boutiques offering her a first look at the spring collections. It was the frantic, panicked voices of the Thorne inner circle. Within minutes, she realized she had been removed from the board of the Heritage Foundation. Within 30 minutes, her gold tier membership at the Meridian Club was suspended pending ethical review. She rushed to the window of the penthouse, expecting to see the city as she always had, as her domain. Instead, she saw 3 news vans parked at the curb and a group of process servers waiting by the lobby entrance. The Thorne era hadn't just ended, it was being erased from the social ledger. Caspian, meanwhile, was sitting in the back of a taxi, having been denied access to his own garage by a security team that had once tipped their hats to him. He was scrolling through his social media feed, watching as his friends, the men he had toasted only 24 hours ago, posted public disclaimers of their association with him. One particularly stinging post from a former business partner read, "Deeply saddened to learn of the alleged improprieties at Vane, we stand with the new leadership under CEO Aurelia Thorne." The ultimate humiliation, however, took place in the lobby of the Obsidian Plaza. Caspian, desperate and disheveled, tried to storm past the front desk, screaming about his divine right to the building. But the digital displays in the lobby, which usually showcased Caspian's polished headshot as the face of the future, had been updated. His face was gone. In its place was a massive, high-definition portrait of Aurelia. She looked regal, untouchable, and utterly dominant. Below the image were the words, "A new standard of excellence, under new leadership." The crowd of commuters and junior staffers who had once whispered in awe of Caspian now moved around him like he was a stain on the marble. He was the clerk's husband, the man who had tried to steal from the most powerful woman in the city and lost. When Leocadia finally managed to reach the lobby, clutching her designer bags in a desperate attempt to flee before the bailiffs arrived at the penthouse, she found Caspian standing there, staring up at Aurelia's image. "They've cancelled the charity gala, Caspian," Leocadia hissed, her voice trembling. "They've frozen my lines of credit. I tried to order a car, and the agency told me my name was on a no-service list. What have you done?" Caspian didn't answer. He couldn't. He was watching a news report on the lobby's ticker. It stated that Aurelia Thorne had just been invited to speak at an economic summit, a slot Caspian had begged for and been denied for 3 years. Aurelia hadn't just taken the company. She had taken the air. She had taken the light. Every social door that had once opened for the Thorne name was now being bolted shut. The invitations to the summer estates, the reservations at the 5-star restaurants, the very respect they used to breathe, it had all evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the Aurelia Thorne world. As the press fans caught sight of them, and the flashes began to pop like a barrage of gunfire, the Thorne legacy was finally laid to rest. They weren't the kings of the city anymore. They were just 2 people in the middle of a lobby, trapped in the shadow of the woman they had once called a mouse. In the world of the elite, social death is swifter than the law. By noon, the name Thorne was a punchline. Aurelia hadn't just fired them, she had unmade them. As she stepped out onto her private balcony at the Vane headquarters, looking over the city she now truly owned, she knew the coronation was complete. The crown wasn't just hers. It always had been. The Great Hall of Vane Industries was packed to its structural limits. From the senior directors to the night shift custodial staff, every employee stood in a charged, anxious silence. The air was thick with the hum of high-definition projectors and the soft rustle of tablets. For years, these people had lived under the erratic, loud-mouthed reign of Caspian Thorne, a man who led through intimidation and expensive slogans. Now, they were waiting to see the face of Phoenix who had burnt the old order to the ground. At exactly 2 p.m., the lights dimmed, and the massive triptych of screens behind the podium flared to life. They didn't show stock prices or marketing fluff. Instead, they displayed a complex, intricate network of data points, the Vane algorithm. The murmurs began instantly. Every department lead in the room recognized those data points. It was the ghost code that had optimized their logistics for 3 years. It was the silent strategy that had saved their European merger from collapse. They had always been told these innovations were Caspian's midnight inspirations. Aurelia Thorne stepped onto the stage. She wasn't hidden in a charcoal silk gown anymore. She wore a suit of midnight blue, her heels striking the stage with the weight of a heartbeat. She didn't stand behind the podium. She stood at the very edge of the stage, looking out at the sea of faces. "For 3 years," Aurelia began, her voice carrying without the need for a microphone, "you have been told that Vane Industries was steered by the Thorne vision. You were told that your successes were the result of one man's genius, and your failures were the result of your own lack of effort." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the front row, where the junior analyst sat. The truth is, Caspian Thorne couldn't read a balance sheet without help. Every optimization, every strategic pivot, and every major contract signed since 2022 was drafted by me, from a desk you all thought was for clerical filing. The collective gasp was audible. The clerk. The quiet woman who had occasionally brought coffee to the strategy meetings and sat in the corner taking notes. They looked at the screens again. The ghost code. It wasn't Caspian's. It was hers. "I am Aurelia Thorne," she continued, her voice gaining a metallic, unyielding strength. "And I didn't just buy this company, I built it. I built it while my husband mocked me in public and my mother-in-law treated me like a servant in my own home. I allowed the Thorne name to be the face of this firm because I believed in the work more than the credit. But the work is being choked by the ego." She swiped a hand across the air and the screens changed. The Thorne-era expenses were displayed in a brutal side-by-side comparison with the R&D budget. The waste was staggering. "As of this moment," Aurelia announced, "the R&D budget is being tripled. The Executive Entertainment Fund is being abolished, and every one of you who was bullied into silence by the former leadership will find a direct line to my office. We are no longer a family-run vanity project. We are a meritocracy." The silence held for a heartbeat, then a single junior analyst in the back began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the great hall erupted. It wasn't the polite, forced applause Caspian used to demand. It was the sound of 1,000 people realizing they were finally being led by the person who actually knew the way. Aurelia watched them, her face composed but her eyes burning with a quiet fire. She saw Sterling, the CFO, weeping with relief in the second row. She saw the security team standing straighter. The mouse had not only revealed herself as the lion, she had invited the entire pride to hunt. As Aurelia stepped off the stage, the transformation was complete. The staff didn't just see a CEO, they saw the architect of their survival. The clerk was dead. The majority shareholder had arrived, and for the first time in the history of Vane Industries, the person at the top actually deserved the view. The air in the executive suite was stagnant, smelling of stale coffee and the frantic, sweaty desperation of a man who had realized too late that his floor was actually a trapdoor. Caspian Thorne sat behind the massive obsidian desk that he had ordered 3 months ago, a desk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He was frantically shredding papers, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, while Leocadia stood by the window, staring at the news vans below like a prisoner watching her own gallows being built. The heavy oak doors didn't just open. They were retracted by 2 security guards with the synchronized precision of a military operation. Aurelia stepped in. She didn't hurry. She walked with the agonizingly slow pace of a predator who knew the prey had nowhere left to run. Balthazar followed, carrying a slim, black leather briefcase that felt like a coffin for Caspian's future. Caspian didn't look up. "You can't do this, Aurelia. This office is mine. My name is on the lease. The board will never." "The board has already voted, Caspian," Aurelia said, stopping at the edge of the desk. She didn't sit. She simply looked down at the paper scraps littering the floor. "And the lease is held by a holding company you haven't owned since 9 a.m. yesterday. You are currently trespassing in my building." Aurelia signaled to Balthazar, who laid 2 separate documents on the obsidian surface. One was thick, bound in blue cardstock. The other was a single, stark white page. "Caspian, look at me," Aurelia commanded. He finally raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie loosened, the Thorne legacy crumbling in real time. "I am giving you a choice," she said, her voice dropping into a register of terrifying calm. "The blue folder contains the full forensic audit of your embezzlement. It includes the forged signatures, the shell company transfers to Leocadia's gambling accounts, and the internal emails where you threatened the junior accountants. If I hand this to the district attorney, you will be in a jumpsuit by dinner. You will spend the next 15 to 20 years in a cell, and Leocadia will be processed as a co-conspirator." Leocadia let out a strangled sob, her hand flying to her throat, her precious pearls finally snapping and scattering across the floor like tiny white casualties. "However," Aurelia continued, "the white page is a voluntary resignation and a total waiver of all Thorne family claims to Vane Industries. It includes a full confession of your managerial incompetence to be released to the press and a transfer of all your personal assets, the cars, the watches, the properties, to the company as restitution. You sign it, and I let you walk out that door. You will be penniless. You will be a pariah, but you will be free." Caspian looked at the 2 papers. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the desk. You want me to confess? To tell the world I'm a failure? To give you everything?" "You never had everything, Caspian," Aurelia whispered, leaning down until she was inches from his face. "You had a loan, and I'm calling it in. You spent years telling me I was a mouse. You told me to stay in my lane while you drove my car into a wall. Now you're going to sign that paper, or you're going to find out exactly how much vigor the state prison system has." Caspian looked at his mother. Leocadia was no longer the queen mother. She was a terrified old woman looking at a lifetime of poverty or a prison bunk. "Sign it, Caspian," she whimpered. "Please, sign it." With a sob of pure broken pride, Caspian grabbed the pen. It was a Thorne family heirloom, gold-plated and engraved. He scrawled his name across the white page, the ink bleeding into the paper like a final, desperate gasp. Aurelia didn't wait for him to finish the last flourish. She snatched the paper away and handed it to Balthazar. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, finally sitting in the obsidian chair. It suited her perfectly. "You have 5 minutes to take what can fit in your pockets. Security will escort you to the service elevator. I don't want the staff to be distracted by the sight of a thief on their way to lunch." As Caspian and Leocadia were led out, silent and shattered, Aurelia didn't watch them go. She simply opened a new file on her tablet and began the work of rebuilding what they had tried to destroy. The office of the CEO was finally quiet. The obsidian desk was clean. The Thorne name was a ghost, and Aurelia was the only living thing left in the room. She had given him the choice between a cage of iron or a cage of shame. He had chosen shame, but for Aurelia, the result was the same. The debt was settled. The afternoon sun hit the limestone walls of the Thorne Manor with a cruel, mocking brilliance. For 30 years, this estate had been Leocadia's fortress, a monument to her supposed superiority. But as she stood in the grand foyer, surrounded by men in neon yellow vests and professional movers with clipboards, the reality of Aurelia's mercy began to sink in like a slow-acting poison. Caspian stood by the fountain, his shoulders slumped, clutching a single designer suitcase. He looked smaller than he ever had, his expensive suit now appearing 3 sizes too large for his diminished spirit. He had managed to secure a final survival package before the total freeze of his assets, but it wasn't the millions he had envisioned. It was a set of keys to a 40-year-old apartment in the industrial district, a place Leocadia wouldn't have even driven through, let alone lived in. Leocadia watched as a mover began to wrap her favorite Rococo mirror in bubble wrap. "Stop that!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That mirror has been in the Thorne family for—" "Actually, ma'am," the mover said, checking his digital tablet, "this mirror was purchased in 2023 using a Vane Industries office decor grant. It's corporate property. It's going to the auction house." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Aurelia hadn't just taken the company, she had audited their very lives. Every piece of silk, every silver spoon, every velvet curtain had been traced back to the embezzlement. The Thorne heritage was nothing more than a catalog of stolen goods. "Caspian, do something," Leocadia wailed, turning to her son. "Call the lawyers. Call the senators. We cannot be seen in the industrial district. The humidity alone will ruin my skin." Caspian looked at his mother with a dull, hollow gaze. "There are no senators, mother. There are no lawyers." Balthazar made it clear. "If we fight the asset seizure," Aurelia hands the blue folder to the FBI. "Do you want to go to the industrial district, or do you want to go to a federal penitentiary?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of packing tape. Leocadia collapsed onto a Louis XIV chair, only to be told by a bailiff that she had to stand, as the chair was currently being inventoried. She stood, trembling, as she watched her life being dismantled box by box. They were escorted to the curb in a plain silver sedan, not a limousine. As they drove away, Leocadia looked back at the manor. She saw a large "for sale" sign being hammered into the pristine lawn. But it wasn't just any sign. It bore the Vane Industries logo. Aurelia was selling the house to fund the company's new employee childcare center. The ultimate insult, her palace was being turned into a playground for the children of the clerks she had despised. The sedan pulled up to a gray concrete building tucked between a warehouse and a laundromat. The air smelled of diesel and scorched grease. Caspian led her up 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs to a unit that was smaller than her former walk-in closet. Leocadia stood in the doorway of the tiny apartment, staring at the peeling wallpaper and the single, buzzing fluorescent light in the kitchen. There was no room for a maid. There was no room for a vanity. There was barely room for her pride. "This is it," she whispered. her voice a hollow shell. "This is where the Thorne legacy ends?" "There is no legacy, Mother," Caspian said, dropping the suitcase on the linoleum floor. "There's just us, and a bill for the rent that's due in 30 days. Leocadia sank onto the floor, her silk skirt gathering dust, and finally, she broke. She didn't cry with the elegance of a martyr. She wailed with the raw, ugly realization of a woman who had spent her life building a mountain out of sand, only to watch the tide come in. The collapse was total. In the quiet of that dingy apartment, the roar of the Thorne name was replaced by the hum of a cheap refrigerator. Leocadia Thorne had spent decades looking down on the world. Now, for the first time in her life, she was forced to look up, and all she could see was the ceiling of a life she had earned. The glass-walled auditorium of the summit was perched high above the city, a sanctuary for the minds that shaped the global future. For years, Caspian Thorne had lusted after an invitation to this stage, viewing it as the ultimate confirmation of his self-proclaimed brilliance. But as the delegates from 50 nations took their seats, the name Caspian was nothing more than a cautionary footnote in a corporate law textbook. Aurelia Thorne stood in the wings, watching the digital ticker above the stage. Vane Industries' stock had not just recovered, it had surged by 22% in the week since the Thorne purge. The market hadn't mourned the loss of the family name, it had celebrated the arrival of the architect. She wore a gown of deep emerald, the color of growth, of rebirth, and of the cold, hard currency she had reclaimed. In her hand, she held a small tablet containing the blueprints for her next 10 years. She wasn't here to talk about vision or legacy. She was here to talk about the math of power. As the moderator announced her name, the applause was different from the polite, hollow clapping she had heard at the gala. This was the sound of respect earned through bloodless warfare. Aurelia stepped into the spotlight, the silence that followed absolute. For too long, Aurelia began, her voice steady and echoing with an ancient authority. We have allowed the noise of ego to drown out the signal of competence. We have built empires on names, while ignoring the hands that actually lay the bricks. I spent 3 years as a clerk in my own company, watching the people I loved try to dismantle the work I created. She looked directly into the camera lens, knowing that in a dingy apartment in the industrial district, 2 people were likely watching. They thought my silence was a sign of defeat. They thought my service was a sign of submission. But the greatest weapon an architect has is the ability to wait until the foundation is set. Today, the foundation of Vane Industries is no longer a name. It is a reality. She spent the next 20 minutes outlining a global strategy that shifted the company from a vanity project to a powerhouse of sustainable innovation. When she finished, the room didn't just applaud. They rose. It was a standing ovation from the most powerful people on earth. Not for the wife of Caspian Thorne, but for Aurelia Thorne, the woman who had bought the world while her enemies were busy polishing their mirrors. As she exited the stage, Balthazar was waiting with a final set of documents. The divorce is finalized, Aurelia. The last of the Thorne assets have been liquidated. The child care center at the old manor opens tomorrow. Aurelia took the papers and tucked them away. She walked to the window, looking down at the city lights. Somewhere down there in the dark, Caspian was probably staring at a flickering television, and Leocadia was likely trying to figure out how to wash her own clothes. She felt no pity, no anger, and no joy. She felt only the profound, clean silence of a closed ledger. She turned to Balthazar, a faint, sharp smile touching her lips. The project is complete. What's the next acquisition on the list? The clerk was a memory. The mouse was a myth. As Aurelia stepped into her car, leaving the world of the Valles far behind in the dust of history, she knew that the greatest victory wasn't the company, the mansion, or the crown. It was the simple, undeniable truth that she was the one holding the pen. And for Aurelia Thorne, the story was only just beginning.